Today, I visit with Adam Balfour on his new book, Ethics and Compliance for Humans.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and you are in for an uber treat today because I have with me Adam Balfour. Adam is well known within the compliance community, but we're here to talk about, I believe, your first book, which is Ethics and Compliance for Humans. So, first of all, Adam, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Tom. Pleasure to be here today. Thank you.
Adam, for those who may not know you, they may suspect you're not from the great state of Texas. And if that suspicion is correct, could you tell us where you're from, but more importantly, what you're up to these days?
Absolutely. So I was born and raised in Scotland. So spent my complete upbringing there, did law school over there, and then moved to the US just under 20 years ago. So I've moved around now in Nashville, Tennessee, which we've been here for about the last 10 years. But I worked in compliance now for the last several years, currently work at Bridgestone, where I get to lead our compliance program for the Americas region.
So, we're here to talk about your book, Ethics and Compliance for Humans. Let me start off by asking, why did you write this book?
It was something I'd wanted to write for a long time. It had been a long time goal for me to write a book. And so this had been something that had been in the works for quite a few years. And then probably it was the end of last year, our very good mutual friend, Sarah Haddon, and I started really talking, and it came to life then. Yeah, something I've always wanted to do. And just once the idea came together, once I had more of the thoughts and the vision, the writing process was actually a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. And Sarah and her team were just fantastic to work with, made the process completely painless and actually really enjoyable.
I remember, I don't know if Dick Casson, but he founded the FCP. I'd blogged for a year and I'd emailed him, I've got 200 blogs, look at me. And his email back was, great. When is your first book coming out? Oh, nothing like a swift kick in the pants to get you going. I'm going to start with the introduction because you begin with a true tragedy, a tragedy that happened to your town, your city, and the people of Nashville. So I want to ask you, what was that tragedy and why did you open your book with that tragedy?
Yeah, so this was and it truly was a tragedy, the shooting at Covenant School much earlier this year. That was actually a late change to the book. That was probably the final change that I made, was to rewrite the introduction. And it was actually, a lot of my ideas come to me when I go for runs. And I was running one day and just thinking about that matter. And I thought about the speech that our governor gave the day after. And I thought there were so many points in there that kind of really highlight that, like, human beings, we can do absolutely terrible things. Hopefully, most of us will never do anything as horrific as that individual did that day. But in the other end of the spectrum, humans can do just unbelievable things, truly acts that are just show that the best of humanity. Those police officers that ran in complete disregard for their own safety. And so I thought that was really something that I wanted to highlight, was what we heard from our governor. Really, humans can do wonderful things and can do terrible things. How do we help drive ourselves, both individually and collectively, to do better, to do what we've got the good potential to do? And that's really what I think ethics and compliance is about, right? So we're in the business of connecting with people and helping them. So that was really at the start of it. And I thought just something very close to us. I've got four very young children who go to school very close to the Covenant School.
I've had the opportunity to see you on a webinar where you've talked about your book. And in your webinar, you start with a question and you start chapter one with a question. And I'm going to read the question, which is, did you read your car manual in its entirety before you drove your car for the first time? And at least in the group that I was a part of, I was the only person who had done so.
Maybe you, Wendy Badger, and one other. I'm forgetting the other person's name. But yeah, there's only three of you, Tom, that have done that.
I will say I had two inspirations. One was an engineer father who said, you will read this before you drive your car. And this was 1971. So a car manual was about 30 pages in a booklet form, and it actually could be read and digested. But I wanted to ask why you started with that question and really about the chapter one opening.
Yeah, I think, you look at any brand, you can't just create a brand and then think it's done. I think you've got to continuously work on the brand, and the brand has to evolve as well over time. So I think it is. I think we've got so many people at Bridgestone who I think understand and appreciate the value that we bring. But every now and then you see some of those perceptions pop up. Or we have new people who join, and they're thinking, this is what compliance does, or my prior organization, this is what I've seen. And so I do like to refer to them being more as perceptions rather than necessarily misperceptions. I don't think when people approach us in ethics and compliance and they think this is what it's all about, that I don't think is their fault. I think it's really that the brand of ethics and compliance, and we certainly have to address that. So I think it's one of these things where we're always going to be addressing some of those perceptions and brand challenges. I think we just have to continue to work on that, build relationships, have conversations with people, and really help them understand that we're there to help, we're there to add value, and really to prevent harm within our societies and communities.
Adam, chapter 4 is entitled Who Are the Humans We're Trying to Help? And you've got some, frankly, fairly sad stories and notes in this chapter about some of the things that have happened to people. But what really intrigued me was the end of your chapter, where you have a shaded box entitled Humans Aren't Data Points. And when I read through this chapter first, I went, oh, there's a lawyer. He puts the most important thing on the last sentence because that's how I write. I'm continually called out by my journalist colleagues. You bury the lead in the last two lines, Tom. Nobody cares. They won't get there. But I got here and this one really struck me. And I think it's something that's much broader than the human story, even, which is humans aren't data points. And I wanted to maybe ask you about that, why the human story in compliance is so important and how you use that moving forward.
Yeah, I think it is. I think there's been all sorts of studies before that you read of an airplane crash going down with 500 people on board. We're almost desensitized to that. But if you hear of a single individual story, I think it has a much greater impact on us as humans. And so I think a lot of what we do reports to the board and to senior leadership. We have our dashboards, we have our metrics. Maybe we talk about the ethics helpline. We talk about the number of reports and all of that data. But I think behind that data, there are those very real human stories and human experiences. And so I don't think you can really sit down with your board and say, okay, we had 500 matters that were raised this year. Let me tell you about every single one of those human beings. But I think it's more than just a data point. It's more than just a categorization of the type of matter raised. And I think sometimes if you look at workplace bullying or harassment or discrimination, from an organization's perspective, that may be a very small, almost immaterial issue. But from the individual's experience, that can be absolutely huge. That can be impacting everything for them at their job. It can be impacting their life in general. So I think it's a little bit of kind of balancing. How do we not lose sight of the fact that people are involved? And I think once you put those human stories there, I think it demystifies ethics and compliance. I think it also helps people care a little bit more about what we're doing. And it's not just data points, but it's real people and their real stories behind it.
Adam, chapter 5 is the speak up problem. You've got a lot of information. This is a really important chapter, but there was a couple of pages that struck me as incredibly useful. And frankly, the only place I had seen this information, whether you call it a KPI, whether you call it a data point, collected in one place, and it's entitled Far From Exhaustive. The following lists are examples of retaliatory acts. And why I thought this was as significant as any other part of your book is this seemed to me that you gave every compliance professional a list of acts, and certainly it's not exhaustive, but a list of acts that they could then, frankly, look at others' situations in their company. I don't want to say benchmark, but they could look for patterns. I don't know if that was your intention, but it seems to me this is almost in the category of lessons learned.
I think so. I think that the reason I really wanted to lean into to retaliation and even including some information about blacklisting and other things as well is I think we talk a lot about retaliation. I think pretty much every organization has an anti-retaliation policy. We have zero tolerance for it. That's just a policy. But I think it's actually looking past that and recognizing that retaliation happens everywhere around the world. And I think it's really what does it actually look like in practice? And frankly, what's some of that impact on people? Because it's not just retaliation is wrong, there's consequences, there's impact that that brings on different people. And I think having not necessarily a checklist, but just additional things that we can be thinking about to be able to identify or share with their colleagues, particularly in HR. This is what retaliation looks like in practice. I do think we've got to get past kind of the almost like theoretical where retaliation is wrong, but really putting it into real life terms as to what that means. Same with some of the data, I think, around retaliation and blacklisting. I think it's been years since there's been any data that at least I've come across. But I did cite a study from many years ago that really talks about the human impact that whistleblowers who've been retaliated against, that the consequences, negative impact has had for them. I think we've got to see that. We've got to recognize the harm that's been done and figure out much better ways to be able to address that and prevent it when it happens.
Adam, chapter 6 is entitled Listening and Learning, Humanizing Training and Embracing Feedback. And in many ways, for me, this was the most fun chapter. And I just want to focus on your use and your compliance team's use of movies, TV show, and pop culture in telling stories. I've privileged to see a presentation where you talked about that. But how do you really utilize pop culture and current movies as a part of the learning, but more importantly, storytelling of compliance?
I appreciate that. And Tom, your knowledge of all sorts of different movies, all the different episodes, I feel I get nothing on what you've done. But the reason I think I like to do it is ethics and compliance, I think to a lot of people it can seem abstract, it can seem scary. And so I think how do we get past that? And so I think when you look at things such as the adult learner theory, how we learn as adults is different to how we learn as kids. And so we've got the adult learner experience. We've got experiences that we can draw on. Either it's our own experiences or it's things like pop culture, movies, TV shows that are relevant. And I think that can serve as a kind of nice framework that we can use to help people understand ethics and compliance. I approach learning as how do we do from the learner's perspective the minimal amount of change necessary. So I think if you go in and try and train people on bribery or antitrust, that can be a lot of learning that has to happen, right? You've got to build up a lot of those steps. But I think if you can take a different approach and say, we're going to talk about Star Wars. Could Anakin have been saved from turning to the dark side? A lot of people are already familiar with those movies and those stories. So I think we're starting from a nice place. And where we need to get them from in terms of point A to point B, there's a much smaller gap because we're using something that's already very familiar to them. And then we can layer on top of that, here's the additional concepts I want you to learn. So I think it's drawing on the familiar, it's drawing on the things that we can already connect with. And I think that just makes it easier for people to learn about what we're trying to convey to them. And also, when you're talking about Star Wars or we've done Top Gun, we've talked about all sorts of things. I did a Tiger King School of Internal Investigations paper a couple of years ago that when Tiger King was popular for a while. But I think also what you can cover in 30 minutes or 1 hour talking about those movies, you couldn't cover in 5 or 6 hours of a much more traditional training approach. Here's the dry topic. So I think for so many reasons, it's just more engaging, it's more effective. And I think storytelling makes it much more memorable for people as well.
Adam, chapter 7 is entitled Look Who's Talking, Leverage the Voice of Leaders, Managers, and Supervisors. And you have a short section you entitle it 5 Tactics for Success, where you give some tangible points that you can involve leaders in or talk to them about. My experience with most leaders is they're more than happy to help, but they really don't have an idea of what they can do or even the power of them saying a few words. So I wondering if you'd say, how do you help coach a leader to be a leader in compliance?
Yeah, and part of my frustration, I think, with a lot of codes of conduct is that they'll talk about leaders and managers having an increased responsibility, a special responsibility when it comes to ethics and compliance, or telling employees that your leader or manager or supervisor is in the best place to help you with any ethical dilemmas that come up. I don't think that's always true. I think that creates an expectation in terms of employees. I think it also puts a lot of pressure on leaders, but we're not really conveying, okay, here's what you actually need to do to turn those expectations into reality and to help ensure that those responsibilities are actually being performed. And so I think one of the things that there's no kind of magic way to measure whether or not a compliance program is effective. But I do think for me, one of the things that I can tell very quickly is if leaders and managers are talking on a regular basis about ethics and compliance. And so I think it's really just a way of connecting with leaders. I've done a number of one-on-ones with leaders over the years where I've given them really a safe space to ask me questions, for me to share with them, look, this is what we're going to be doing. This is what we're working on. What's your thoughts? What's your ideas? What questions do you have? Or what questions do you think people are going to ask you as a leader or manager? So I think it's really trying to move past this idea of, what we simply state in a lot of codes of conduct, and really helping leaders with very practical guidance on what they can and should be doing. But also recognizing a lot of leaders are incredibly busy. If we're to ask them to spend 4 or 5 hours a month supporting ethics and compliance, that's not going to happen. But I think when we encourage them to use things like compliance tips of the month, that takes between 1 and 3 minutes at most of their time. But the impact of that 1 to 3 minute conversation with their team can just be absolutely huge. It could really support the program, support your organizational culture and values, and just makes an impact on the employees.
Next up is a very provocatively entitled chapter. Sometimes compliance is awkward. And apparently you embrace the awkwardness. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this chapter?
I do. And one of my favorite coffee mugs has awkward as my specialty on it, which I really love. But I think it's recognizing compliance can sometimes put people in awkward positions. And one of the examples I share in the book is really about gifts and entertainment, right? You can have a policy that says, here's our limits, or there's no gifts and entertainment. But if someone is presented with a gift or an invitation to entertainment from someone that they've got a really important relationship with, that puts them in a very awkward position. So I think for us in compliance is to sometimes recognize that it is going to be awkward. How do we lean into that? And I include in that chapter some guidance that people can use in that situation to say, if you've received a gift that you can't accept, they can say, look, I really appreciate that the kind offer. It's not a personal rejection, but I hope you understand I need to comply with our policy. So I think it just is a way to recognize the challenges and also make our programs more effective because we give people a way to deal with that awkwardness.
Adams, next up is chapter entitled What's in It for Me? The Role of Recognition and Incentives. And here you talk about annual performance goals, but you list out, I think, five different goals that people could put in place. I had this conversation as recently as yesterday on how do we incentivize compliance? How do we incentivize something people should be doing anyway? So, what were these goals, and really, how can you help or how can you work towards putting an incentive program or compliance incentives in part of your overall evaluation for discretionary incentive bonus?
Yeah, and it's obviously an area I think we've heard a lot from the DOJ on in recent years, incentives and clawbacks. And so I think some of the examples I included in there, I think are things that leaders can and should be doing. So even we just mentioned about getting leaders to use their voice, making sure that they're having regular conversations, using things if you put out a compliance tip of the month to make sure they're using that. But also I think for them to take some accountability for their team, right? They are leaders of others. So if your program has required learning, I think that the leaders should have some skin in the game to make sure that they have led their team to actually get the mandatory or required things completed. And so I think there's definitely ways in which you can factor that into to their incentives. Both, I think, there's a way to hold back compensation if someone is not performing as they should. But also like to highlight, I think there's other things that you should be doing to recognize and celebrate people. Sometimes that can be financial rewards if they do these things. Sometimes I think even social recognitions. So we created at Bridgestone our Leading with Integrity Awards, where we allow employees to nominate others. And then we have a panel of other leaders who pick the winners. So at no point do I nominate people or select who wins. It's all kind of peer based, which I think is a really nice thing. And then what we've done is we've had our CEO and one of our directors announce the winners on a large town hall call where we've got hundreds of people. And I think that social recognition can have such a huge impact of the CEO knows my name. The CEO just called me out on a call with hundreds of people, and it was for good things. So I think it's just how do we find those different incentives that are really going to drive and recognize that when leaders do well.
Next up, you have, let me get the title of this chapter, Policies for Humans That Humans Won't Hate. And in it, you give, I won't say a horrifying example of policy failure, but certainly a very bad one. And why you must always give the human element much more importance. And that, of I'll just ask you to talk about it and why you chose this example from United Airlines.
Yeah. Oh goodness, that was such a terrible example where I think it's their now former CEO really highlighted that our policies need to support common sense. And I think people have common sense, right? We need policies to help guide that sometimes and support people. But I think policies can be useful despite my kind of earlier comparison to car manuals. But early in my career, Tom, I worked in New York. I was a securities lawyer, and even then, I saw big investors who are making huge investment decisions. They're not reading the entire document. They're reading what's known as the box, right? It's a summary section at the beginning. So it's how do we recognize and think about some of those lessons and ways in which we can say, look, people are probably not going to read a policy in its entirety, but they're going to read some elements of it. They're maybe going to read a short summary, but also making sure that people get freedom, they can think within their roles, but also having the right guidance as well.
Next up, we have a chapter entitled A Letter to Your Organization's Leaders, Managers, and Supervisors. And in it, you pose the question that I will be very intrigued to hear your answer to. And that question is, quote, does an effective ethics and compliance program really increase or otherwise financially support the organization? What's your experience?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's my experience, but I think there's so many data points out there now as well that an effective ethics and compliance program is not just about avoiding fines or penalties or avoiding being in the headlines for the wrong reasons, but all sorts of metrics and data points out there now that you can see an increased return on assets. You can see fewer material lawsuits, lower settlement amounts. So I think absolutely an ethics and compliance program, we add a lot of value to our organizations. I like to compare as having grown up in the UK, I think of football as being soccer. I think we're a little bit like midfielders, right? We're in that second line of defense. We help defend, but we can also help attack as well and support the growth of the organization. So can we add value? Is it more than just fines and penalties? Absolutely. We are there to support the business for that.
I have to take that analogy, but I will have to take it in a very different way because I always considered a midfielder to be an offensive player.
I
And that actually they're in control of the ball and they're just setting up those number 10s to
we're
do
we're
their thing.
we're in that really, I think, central place. And of course, we could get into a whole different conversation on this, but I think we have that ability to help both support and defense. But I think we've got that ability to maybe work in a more of a central midfielder where we can play back and we can move forward as well. We're pretty pivotal and key to the whole operation.
Okay. Yeah, I never would have considered a midfielder or defender. Naive American, no doubt. You end with, originally thought a fairly provocative chapter, but the more I read about it and thought about it, this may be your most passionate chapter. And it's entitled Towards a Chief Purpose Officer.
Mhm.
So tell us about this chapter.
Yeah, I think it is. It's something that I've been thinking about for a while. Where I think there's so many different areas and organizations today, which I think are almost operating in a little bit of a silo. So I think you've got compliance. I think we've got ESG, which I think is going through a lot of change, a lot of transformation right now. You've got DE&I, but I think it's really how do you think about what your organization's purpose is, and really bringing those functions together under a chief purpose officer who I think really should have a central place in the C suite that is helping make sure that the organization stays true to what its stated purpose is. So it's something that I think I call out Patagonia as an example that I think is very committed to its purpose. I don't think Patagonia, at least not to my knowledge, has a designated chief purpose officer. So I think some organizations, it may not be necessary to create a standalone position. But I do think in other organizations, having this idea of a chief purpose officer that supports the CEO, supports the CFO in delivering on their results, that really helps ensure that the organization truly obsesses about its purpose and conducts business in the right and appropriate way as well.
Adam, there's a lot of other resources you have at the end of the book. You have questionnaires, you have checklists, you have some templates. All in all, an incredibly useful book for every compliance professional. And unfortunately, now we're near the end of our time. But before we leave, I wanted to ask if our listeners wanted the book or perhaps have more information about you, what would be the best place or places for them to go?
So the book is available for sale online at Amazon and some other online bookstores as well. But Amazon sells everything, including this book, which is great. And certainly, if people want to learn more about me, they can reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn pretty frequently and check my messages. So it's always great. I love our compliance community because people reach out and always happy to help support others because many people have been so supportive of me along the way. Different ways to reach out.
Adam, I wanted to shout out to you for writing this book. It's a big deal to write your first book. I certainly know that. And this book is incredibly useful and helpful. So kudos for that. And it's going to wait for the sequel.
I'm going to take a little break, but I've got some ideas. We'll see. We'll see.
Adam, thanks again. And I hope we can continue this conversation.
Thanks so much.
This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Sunday Book Review Authors Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you'll subscribe, rate, and review wherever great podcasts are listened to. The Sunday Book Review Authors Podcast is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.